Thank you very much. And obviously, there's many downsides to this tragic pandemic, but one of the little silver linings is that people are getting used to electronic communication from all around the world, and that's the way that people can connect wherever we may be, and that's a beautiful thing. So what we're going to try to do is I'll tell you drop a little bit about myself. We'll talk about, as we said, the past, present, and future of Denmark. And the way I think we'll do it is we'll divide it between before the war, during the war, and after the war, the Second World War, of course, I'm referring to. So let's start with myself. And I have a little PowerPoint here that I am going to share. Hold on. And that is share screen, exactly. And here we've got a little PowerPoint. And okay, so Jewish Denmark. And let's just see how we get this. Yes. So, born in London, England, studied in the USA, married to Rachel. There is a picture of my wonderful family. And underneath is a picture of my grandson, of course. So he gets a special mention. I have one grandchild. Now, Denmark is a very interesting country, especially when compared to the United States. And a little bit later, we'll talk about that. And I know it's actually come up a couple of times in the American elections, and I always look at that in an interesting way. But if we go all the way back, meaning Jews have been in Denmark since the middle of the 1600s, and there was a king at that time called King Christian IV. He liked the Jews. Part of the reason why he liked the Jews is because he'd been involved in many military adventures, and he was sort of running out of money. And he was speaking, and I think it was the King of Holland who was related to him, and he said, how do you manage to have these military adventures? At that time, Holland was also, they had the colonies and so forth. And they said, well, we've got some Jews, and the Jews are good finance. They're very good finances. Get a few Jews, and they will help you. And so King Christian IV, and this is actually, Denmark is kind of unique. The Jews did not come here as refugees. They came here as invited and honored guests. And because of that, I'm not going to say the Jews have been treated perfectly, but they've been treated quite well, and in a way quite differently than some of the other European countries, of course, culminating in the Second World War and the rescue that took place then. But this King Christian IV, he liked the Jews so much that he actually made a coin. For those that can read Hebrew, on the right-hand side, that is the letter Yud, and then there's a Hey, and it's a little bit funny. It's not your typical thing, and a letter Vav and a Hey, which is God's name in Hebrew. This coin is called Hebreia, which means the Hebrew, and it was, and underneath I think it says something Judex. Yeah, I think it's something Judex, which is, the point being is that he made this because of his feeling and connection to the Jewish people. For those that have been to Copenhagen, and for those that haven't, you're welcome to come as soon as this pandemic is over. This is a very famous site. You can actually climb up to the top. It was built in the 1600s by King Christian IV. It's called the Round Tower because, you guessed it, it's round and it's a tower. And you could climb to the roof and you see the entire Copenhagen. On the side of it, the picture that I have on my left is taken from a different angle. But on the other side of it, there is what's on the picture on the right. There you can see it's 1642. And the third line down, which I've circled, is actually, again, a Hebrew letters, God's name in Hebrew, a Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey, which is commonly known as God's name that we're even careful to pronounce. So there we have the beginning of the Jewish people. They were invited, so there wasn't that many of them. And they start off with a few hundred, and then it comes to a few thousand. Now, this is a map of Denmark. Geography is always important when trying to understand these stories. And on my right, there is Copenhagen, which is where today the majority of the Jewish people live. But between basically the 18th and 19th century, and actually during this past summer, I tried to make an effort that all these places where there's a red spot, right, thanks to my little iPhone, I put a red spot on all these spots. There are Jewish cemeteries in all these places from communities. A cemetery obviously shows a permanence of a Jewish community. And so you have one all the way in top at Aalborg, which is actually about a 5 hours drive from Copenhagen, and then down to Randers and Aarhus, Horsens, Fredericia, 3 other places on the other island, and gives us 10 Jewish cemeteries around Denmark. Now, an important thing to notice about Denmark is that the border, if you notice the border is just by the city of Flensborg right now. But in the 1860s, the border went all the way down to Hamburg. Now, Hamburg is a relatively famous Jewish city. In fact, Hamburg at that time had an area called Altona, and it had its own tradition of prayer, and that was a part of Denmark. So there was a famous rabbinical conflict in the 1700s between a fellow called Rabbi Yonason Ebershitz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden. They were arguing about the role of mysticism in Judaism, and this was all based in Altona in Hamburg, and therefore the Danish king was the one that intervened and was asked to decide whether or not the Kabbalistic preferences of Rabbi Yonason Ebershitz were inside the realm of traditional Judaism or outside the realm of traditional Judaism, which was obviously something the king was not qualified to do, but he did manage to bring about some sort of, calm and peace, and so that, that was positive. But that has obviously impacted Jewish life. The border then shifted. It used to be, the border has gone all the way from the city of Kolding in the north. That was at one time the border of Germany. It went all the way down to Hamburg at another time, and now since I think it's 1860, it's been by Flensborg, where it is right now. But you had Jewish life, what we call in the provinces, which means in all these little towns, but then slowly they were small communities, and I visited actually almost all of these cemeteries. The smallest one has 7 graves, very nicely preserved by the local council. And the biggest one has about 80 graves, very small. And the people generally moved to Copenhagen, which is where by the beginning of the 1900s, Jewish life is more or less centered. Now, in 1819, you do have an unfortunate incident of anti-Semitic riots where a number of Jews are killed, but that is actually the only overt anti-Semitic events that you do have. And you do have some prominent Jews within society. Kierkegaard, of course, the famous philosopher, was not Jewish, right? The question was, where do I live? I live in Copenhagen. I'm sitting right now in Copenhagen in the Chabad house. We live upstairs. I'm being protected by soldiers of the Danish government, has given soldiers to all the Jewish institutions to protect them. We'll get to that in a minute. But you did have some prominent Jews in various positions in society. The director, the founder of the famous bank, which later became the Danish Bank, very famous. Unfortunately, it became Unfortunately, it became a famous.
Sorry.
Okay, are we good?
Yep.
Hope so. Great. The famous Danish Bank, the person that wrote the Constitution for Greenland, there were Jewish ministers. Kierkegaard was not Jewish. There was a famous critic of his called Goldschmidt, who was obviously Jewish, but Kierkegaard still liked the Jewish people. So you have some prominent Jews throughout the society. Now, an interesting thing, and I understand this is a Reform community, an interesting thing that happened in Denmark regarding the impact of the Reform on the Jewish community is that the community decided, there was a rabbi in the 1800s, decided that he wanted to keep what was called an Einheitsgemeinde, which was a united community, that they should try to be able to make some agreements that the Reforms would find acceptable, and in a way that it should still be Orthodox. Now, the truth be told is that today, if you walk into the synagogue coming from a Reformed community in America, it's an Orthodox synagogue, but the women and men are sitting separately and so forth, and they don't use microphones. But at that time, this was the attempt to hold the community together, and they did what was called the Einheitsgemeinde, which was that they try to have everybody together, which to some degree definitely worked. Although obviously when you try to be for everybody, obviously some people are going to be unhappy, and that happens in many situations. If we then go to the beginning of the 1900s, meaning the beginning of the 20th century, there's a large influx of Russians. And the Russians are, of course, probably many people here, their great-grandparents came, or grandparents or great-grandparents came between 1880 and 1920, which is people, the Kishinev massacre and the various things that happened in the Pale of the Settlement that caused everybody to escape Russia and Ukraine and Galicia and that area. And many of them came to Denmark as a stop before they were going to America, and they stayed here. They got, kind of got stuck here. And so actually the Jewish community of today is largely made up of descendants of those Russian immigrants, because the vast majority of the original Jews, who were actually from Amsterdam or Holland, they were actually Portuguese Jews. The vast majority of them have assimilated. There are some descendants, but the vast majority have assimilated. There's been a very high level of assimilation, and they're not so involved in Jewish life and the Jewish community. Now, if we then go towards, I'm going to share the screen again. If we then go to the Holocaust, 1940, of course, is the time. Let's just hold on. Let's just get this going. Have I shared the screen? Yes, I have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And okay. So let's go back to this map, because on the right side of the map, you will see there is Copenhagen. And at the top, you'll see a little city called Helsingborg. It's missing the B-O-R-G. That Helsingborg is actually Sweden. Everything on the right is Sweden. So if you see, Denmark and Sweden are very close. Now, you can also see at the bottom that Denmark and Germany are bordering each other. So April 9th, 1940, Denmark is invaded, and within about 2 hours, they surrender. There's no resistance. And there's basically an agreement between the government and the Germans that the government would continue to function with a German ambassador. And this goes on from 1940, 41, 42, and 43. And for example, where I am sitting right now in this room was a Nazi, this room is in the Chabad house, this room was a Nazi headquarters. And next door, the building is building number 10. Next door is building number 12, which is a little synagogue called Machzikei Hadas, which has been there since 1933. And the synagogue was functioning, and the Nazis would sit outside in the backyard and smoke their cigarettes and listen to the rabbi giving a speech in the synagogue. Windows were open in the summer. I heard this described to me by people who actually saw this. 1940, 41, 42, 43, on the Allied radio from England, they made fun of Denmark. They said Denmark is Hitler's pet. He does whatever he wants with it. And slowly, partially, this is after Pearl Harbor and after Stalingrad, there's a recognition that the Allies are going to win the war, and the Danes are saying, where are we in this? And they begin resisting. And this resistance consists of blowing up factories, blowing up bridges, blowing up trains, killing collaborators, and things like that. And at a certain point, the Danes, the Nazis are arresting these people, and then they're putting them in Danish prisons. And the Danish prisons actually, in some cases, are actually allowing them back out in the night to go do the resistance. So you have this scenario where the Germans are arresting people, but the Danes are insisting, we're the sovereign leaders of this country, we're the ones that have to imprison and punish people. At a certain point, the Germans say, we are declaring martial law, and therefore the Danish government is not in charge anymore and the Danish government resigns. This is in 1943, August of 1943. Just near my house, about 10 minutes walk from here, there is a police museum. And I remember going once to the police museum a few years ago, and there was an old man who works in the police museum, people that used to be policemen. And there was a man, I say old, although old is a very generic term, because he was 89 years old. And he told me, he said, when he saw my kippah and he saw that we were Jewish, he said, "Oh, I remember you people." And I said, "Well, from where?" And he said, "From Buchenwald." And he said what had happened was, I didn't know about this part of the story, but he said that the Danish police, 20,000 people, had been given a choice. Either you join the Nazis as the police, or we don't want you hanging around here with the potential for making trouble. You're going to be sent off to Buchenwald. He was 16 years old. He'd just joined the police 1 month before. He was given that choice, and with, if I understood correctly, every single other policeman in Denmark, he chose to be sent to the concentration camp, where they were sent to Buchenwald. They were not put to death. They were not slave labor, but they were kept there. They did get packages from the Danish Red Cross, but they were in this camp together with Jews. That's, shall we say, one detail. 1943, in the end of August and the end of September, Eichmann says, our cooperation agreement with Denmark is now over. It is time to ship the Jews to concentration camps. We are going to round up all the Jews. And at that time, the Danish resistance said, we are going to rescue all of the Jews. And basically, there was not one Jew who lacked a place to hide. And I'll show you. So these are so basically in October 1943, which October was Rosh Hashanah, it was the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jews were transported. And if you look on the right of this picture, you can see there's a whole area of coast. It's about 100, maybe, it's about 100 kilometers, which is like a little bit like about whatever, 70, 80 miles, where the ride to Sweden is not so far. There is one spot right at Helsingborg where it's extremely close. That was very well protected by the Germans. But everywhere else, up and down the coast, the Danes, the fishermen took boats and took the Jews over to Sweden. Niels Bohr had traveled to Sweden a week or two before, and he'd gotten the king of Sweden. Sweden at that time was neutral. Sweden was also a little bit on the wrong side of the war because they'd helped the Nazis a little too much. And he said, you have to save the Jews. And the king of Sweden got on the radio and said, any Danish person, Jewish or resistance or anybody that comes to Sweden, we will welcome you in. And that's what they did. And over here, you have, these are a couple of boats that were used. That one of them, the one on the right, is an actual picture of the Jews arriving in Sweden. There were smaller boats, there were bigger boats, all different sizes. Hundreds, maybe even thousands, 7,000 Jews were saved that way. About 500 Jews were not saved, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. But of those 500 Jews, about 500 were taken to Theresienstadt, 450 returned, which means about 51 Jews died in Theresienstadt, and about 30 Jews died in the trip over to Sweden. People drowned. So under 100 Jews died during the Holocaust in the hands or escaping the Nazis. So basically, the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the rabbi said, send a message to everybody. Don't come to shul tomorrow. Don't be at home tonight. And people turned to non-Jewish friends, business partners, A good friend of mine told me he had a school, his father had a schoolmate, all sorts of people, ex-girlfriends, doctors, just somebody that they had a connection with, and they said, can you help us? And either they helped them or they put them in touch with somebody that helped them. And over here, I'm going to show you this gentleman here. That's me together with him. He passed away a couple of years ago. This is a man called Jörn Kieler. And in this picture, I went to his house. He rescued 1,000 Jews. And he told me the following. He said, we needed 5 things. We needed money. We needed boats. We needed a place to hide the Jews. We needed money, guns, and we needed Jews. That was it, to rescue the Jews. That's what he needed. So he described to me, he said money, meaning he's basically one of 4 brothers and a sister. The sister went with her. They were all, some of them were medical students. He became a fairly prominent doctor later. His sister went with her boyfriend. They knocked on all the big houses into the north of the city. They said, we are collecting money to save the Jews. We need money. Everybody's giving a minimum of 10,000 krona. 10,000 krona in today's money is about $2,000. Those days it was closer to $10,000 or $15,000. He said he told me this, and it's written in his book. His sister raised 500,000 krona, probably the equivalent of about 500,000 krona is about $100,000, but at that time, the equivalent of about $5 million in a weekend. They were pretty good fundraisers, but also it was a cause. People said, we want to save the Jews. I don't know, these people in the villas were not necessarily going to themselves go and save the Jews, but they wanted to contribute. He said we needed guns. There was a policeman that had a whole stack of guns because of the Germans confiscated the guns. And he gave them, he said, make sure you kill some Germans with it. Then he said we needed a place to hide the Jews. He said they found a place to hide the Jews. They needed boats. He said we found a guy, we got 10 boats. He said the only problem is we couldn't find any Jews. He said I didn't know any Jews. So he said his sister again went to this area which was like a Jewish area. He didn't say it in so many words, but from the way he said it, it sounded like she worked out from the length of their noses. If they were Jewish, it sounded almost anti-Semitic the way he described it. But he then said, we found 2 Jews, we invited them to come, we saved them, and they brought their family, and they brought their friends, and they brought their this, and they saved 1,000 Jews. There was a hospital near here, I've taken my kids there a few times there, where that hospital saved 2,000 Jews. And they hid the Jews in the beds and in the nurses' quarters and in the tunnels under the hospital, which were connecting the buildings. They staged fake funerals, and they managed to save 2,000 Jews. And in fact, there was a doctor who was running this rescue. I'm not sure the reason why, but for some reason, doctors were disproportionately involved in the rescue of the Jews. And the doctor called over 2 nurses and said, listen, I have run out of money. I need you to go. I know somebody who has money, the king. I'd like you to go into the city and knock on the palace door and say to the king that Dr. So-and-so is asking for money to save the Jews. The 2 nurses said, do you know the king? He said, no, I don't know the king. So why are you sending us? Because he's the king and I'm his citizen. And the Jews are his citizens, and they went and they received a large amount of money. He didn't say how much, but he did write in his book, in his memoirs, we were not disappointed, which means that they got a large amount of money. There's a famous myth that the king wore a yellow star, that the Danish king wore a yellow star. It's not a true story. The reason it's not a true story is because the Danish Jews never had to wear a yellow star. The only yellow star that Danish Jews wore were the 500 Jews that were taken to Theresienstadt. Who were these 500 Jews? There was some of the older people believed that the Nazis would not take them. There were some people that were caught. And then right over here, this is the picture that I'm showing now, is the top of a church, the attic of a church in Gilleleje. And Gilleleje is a city to the north of Copenhagen. If you looked at that map before, I'll go back to it. The Copenhagen, and all the way at the top, there's actually a little point, tiny, where the H of Helsingborg is. It's right over there is the city of Gilleleje, and a lot of people fled from that city. It's not a city, it's a little village. It's a fishing village. And there was a church there. And the priest said, the Jews can come to my church and they can hide here. And every night, 100 Jews came to this church and hid. And in the morning, they stayed there overnight until the weather was good. The weather had to be good so they could go across. And then the next night, they would get on the boats, and the fishing boats would take them over to Sweden. This happened a few times. Unfortunately, somebody in the town, although the vast majority of Danes were positive and supported the rescue, there were some people that were snitches. And so one of them was a person that lived in the town and knew about it, and he informed the Germans. And I have a friend, a neighbor actually, who lives here in this building, who told me that their mother was a little girl at the time, she was 1 year old, and she came with her father, and he came into this church, and he saw there was 100 people there. He said, this is not a safe place to hide. And they went and they hid somewhere else. But unfortunately, the 100 people that were there, the Nazis came and surrounded the church, and they arrested everybody besides for one person who climbed out of the skylight and managed to get away. The priest, unfortunately, after this happened, was devastated by the fact that these people had been taken away because they were hiding in his church, and he actually had a nervous breakdown later on, I think a year or two later. But these 100 and another 400, a total of 500 Jews, were taken by boat to Theresienstadt. The boat was designed to fit 5,000 people, but they couldn't find 5,000 Jews. They could only find 500 Jews, and they took them to Theresienstadt. In Theresienstadt, they wore a yellow star. Right over here, I have a yellow star. This sits on the wall downstairs in our Chabad house. It's a real yellow star that was worn by one of the people in Theresienstadt, one of the Danish people. The Danish Red Cross said, we have to meet the Danish Jews in Theresienstadt. They were the only country that did this. They would send packages, but they said we have to meet them. And so Theresienstadt, they painted it, they pretended it was like, this nice little place. And the Danish delegation came. The first thing the Danish delegation said to the rabbi, who was the leader of the Jewish group, said, he leaned over and whispered in his ear, he said, the king said to send his warmest regards and feelings to his Jewish citizens, and that he's thinking of them. And the king, although, as I mentioned, he did not wear a yellow star because the Danish Jews never had to wear a yellow star, was definitely a part of the symbol of the resistance. He would ride around every day on his horse around Copenhagen, and he was seen in general as being a symbol of the resistance. These Jews that were in Theresienstadt, because of the Danish pressure, the Danes said to the Germans, if anything happens to these Jews, the entire Denmark will be up in flames. So make sure they are treated well and nothing happens to them. The Jews, of course, that were going through it did not know what would or wouldn't happen to them. I mean, every day they were scared they would be sent off to Auschwitz, like all the people that were around them. The people that were around them, the Dutch Jews and French Jews and other Jews that came to Theresienstadt were sent off. They were there for 3-4 weeks. It was a transit camp. They were there for 3-4 weeks, and then they were sent off to Theresienstadt. The Danish Jews remained like that, not being sent away. And then, about a month before the end of the war, in March of 1945, Count Bernadotte, a Swedish count, got permission to bring the Scandinavian prisoners home, which included the Swedes, the Danish Jews, and they brought these, they were called the white buses, white hospital Red Cross buses. They loaded up the 500 Jews, They drove them through Germany, and as I heard from people on these buses, they saw the devastation around them, and then they drove them into Denmark. And this is before the age of highways which go around cities, but this was where the road would connect one city to the next. So they were driving through the center of each city. The resistance thought this was a wonderful opportunity to show how much they liked the Jews and how much they disliked the Germans. So they told everybody, they called ahead and said, the Jews are going to be in your city in another hour. Everybody come out. Hundreds of people came out and lined the streets and threw flowers and chocolate into the buses as a token of their care and affection for the Jews. The Jews did not stay in Denmark at that point. They went over to Sweden and joined the other Jews that had been rescued that were in Sweden, and they remained there until the end of the war. And at the end of the war, they returned. It is truly a remarkable story, and I must say, you know, there are elements of it that it's sometimes hard to believe that such a thing could happen. You know, and there are many different individual stories of people that experience different things. And one of them is of a girl who, and to me, this is a truly remarkable story and really describes the atmosphere in the country, that there was a girl who, for whatever reason, she was 14 years old, she did not escape. She remained behind and she wanted to continue going to school. So she came to the principal of her school and said, I want to continue going to school, but my name is Hannah Cohen and I'm going to get arrested by the Nazis. He says, that's not a problem. You re-enroll in the school with a new name. Let's give you a new name, Anna Kaun, okay? Anna Kaun, that's not a Jewish name. You enroll in the school, and that's what she did. And her whole class knew who she was. All the teachers knew who she was, meaning in the school it was an open secret. But the atmosphere was so pro-Jewish and negative towards helping the Nazis that she was able to do this with safety and confidence. Ultimately, at the end of the war, the Danish Jews, both the ones that go into Terrorism, also the 7,500 that had been in Sweden, they returned to Denmark. And here is, as I mentioned, Jørgen Kila, and the picture on the right. For those that do not read Hebrew, it says Tzadikei Umot Olam, meaning the Tzadikei, I guess, means a tzaddik, a righteous person of the nations. We gave him this testimony. This picture is actually taken right here in this building in the Chabad house, and I believe we gave him what's probably the greatest gift, which was not a piece of parchment, which that is a piece of parchment, but that's not what we felt was a gift. He was sitting there in a room. There was 100 people in the room, and somebody got up. It wasn't deliberate or planned, but it was very moving. And somebody got up and said, Mr. Kila, do you see everybody in this room? Everybody in this room is alive because of you and people like you. They were all people that either were descendants, I think maybe with the exception of me, were the descendants of people that were saved by the Danes. And he said, everybody in this room has been saved by you and the other people of the resistance. And that he was very moved for that. I will say that in this picture that I took with him, he's 94 years old, and I organized a meeting with him, but he would still go swimming every day in the sea. Not in Denmark, there's a tradition, they call them Vikings. The Vikings go swimming every single day of the year, 365 days a year, summer and winter. This is not Texas. This is cold in the winter. They go swimming in the sea. And I said, can we come at 10 o'clock? He said, no, 10 o'clock, I'm swimming in the sea. But 11:30, I'll be ready and you can come. And that's when we came to see him. And he passed away a couple of years ago. This picture was taken in 2013. Now, there were, of course, Nazis. And actually, this picture that I have right here is something that I found last year. In the synagogue next door, there is a little book called a Yizkor book, which is a book that was read on Yizkor. And apparently, at some point, the Nazis came into the synagogue, probably after they discovered that the Jews had escaped And out of anger, they took a knife and they scraped an SS. This black line is actually not a real black line. It's a black line that I drew on top of the scrape. I took a picture and you can feel it with your finger when you rub it along that they did this SS, and I drew it on top to illustrate the SS. You'd have the book in front of you, you could feel this thing, and they scraped that as a sign of their obviously anger and frustration. It's a book made of parchment. It's like an old book, 200 years old. It's a book made of parchment, which was for the Yizkor, the days when we remember people that have passed away, and they did do that. Now, obviously, and now we're sort of moving on to the future, to the present, which is also the present and the future. Obviously, for Danish Jews, World War II, the history is an important part. And today, there are people in their, it's now 75 years, it was 76, 77 years. So there are people in their 80s, including little children that were escaped. So we have actually a couple of times, both when they commemorated 70 years, when 2013, and when they commemorated 75 years, we have done what's called a reenactment. And this is a picture taken from that reenactment, which is we hired a boat. It was not, I don't think this boat was around in 1943, but this is a large shipping boat, and we sail off to Sweden from Denmark, and on board, we had, I think, 7 or 8 people that had themselves done the same trip. And I remember one of them, as we were leaving, one of them turned around and said, "That's the spot my family left from," exactly this spot, because people left from all up and down the coast. And we sail with young people and older people, and the older people tell their story. And we celebrate, and what we do is we don't actually sail all the way into Sweden. We'll get in trouble with the Swedish authorities if we land on Sweden. You have to go through passport control. So we go to the coast where we can see the Swedish coast. We're in Swedish water. We also say Kaddish for the people that were lost at sea, because there were the 30 people that drowned. None of them were ever recovered. They never found their bodies, and they were lost. So we say Kaddish, and then sail back, and that's the way we remember the past. Now, the past is obviously an important part, and then we move on to Jewish life today in Denmark. So, I mean, Denmark in general is, I would say, I hope I'm not going to insult anybody with a reference to political discourse in the United States, but it's a socialist country that works. It does work, which means they have high taxes, they have free education for everybody, free healthcare, and because of that, you have everybody is well trained. There's a safety net for people that are not working, right? Because there's free education, so everybody gets a good education for whatever they're doing, and it means a very well functioning society. Whether or not you can duplicate this works for 5 million people. Whether or not you can duplicate this for 300 million people or 400 million people, that's a question you'll have to decide at the ballot box. I'm not gonna comment on that. But it's a country that works and functions well. People are happy, people are positive, there's a good quality of life, and things are generally positive. And that includes for the Jewish people, with some caveats, with some issues. Unfortunately, one of them has now just come up, which is the issue of an attempt to outlaw Brit Milah, circumcision, but I'll get to that in a minute. So there's a Jewish school which has about 200 students, and this is it's a school of the Jewish community, which the Jewish community is formerly Orthodox, but children from all backgrounds participate. This is the Grand Synagogue, a picture of the big synagogue in Copenhagen. This was built in 1833. It's a very beautiful synagogue, and at this stage they have services there every Shabbat. From the outside, I didn't put a picture from the outside because it actually just doesn't look very remarkable from the outside. It was actually a deliberate attempt by the king, who said you can make yourself a synagogue, but don't make it too outstanding. So on the inside, they made it very beautiful, but not from the outside. At that time in 1833, when they made the synagogue, there were all little synagogues all around Copenhagen, like not actual synagogues, but services held in different places. And part of the condition of making the synagogue was that this would be the only place where services would be held, which was almost kept to, but not completely. And so there you have the synagogue. This picture here is a picture of the little synagogue, which I'm the rabbi of. It's next door. Here, the picture on the left is of the mechitza, the division between men and women, which is in Orthodox synagogues. And in the right, that's this. It's a much smaller synagogue. And actually, like all, they tell the joke about the man that comes to the desert island. And he says, what's this? The guy's been on the desert island for 10 years. He says, this is my house. He says, what's that? That's my synagogue. And come a little later, what's that? He said, that's the other synagogue. That's the synagogue that I never go to. So that's a story of a good Jewish community. And so over here, some people go to one, some people go to the other. Personally, I go to both. There is also a Reform synagogue, although they don't actually have a location. They use... they borrow. There's a church that they borrow, and they meet once a month. And that's a relatively new phenomenon. That's about 10 years old here in Denmark. The president is a very good friend of mine. And so over here over here next door, the synagogue, there is the Chabad house, which, as I mentioned, this building was a Nazi headquarters during the Second World War. It was previously a school for handicapped children, and I'm sitting in it right now upstairs in our lecture room. So those are some of the things that you have going on in Copenhagen. And so therefore, we have a Chabad, we have a camp and a Hebrew school. We also have a nice kosher restaurant, adult education, and so forth, and many other events. Now, I would love to say that everything is hunky-dory and it's perfect, but it's not. And the first difficult issue is terrorism. And unfortunately, in 1980 already, there was a bomb placed close to the synagogue, and since then there's been security, volunteer security by the synagogue. In 2015, there was a bat mitzvah of a very good friend of ours, and the bat mitzvah was in the social hall behind the synagogue. And then, as I left the bat mitzvah, there was a security guard called Dan, and a nice Jewish young man who was guarding as a volunteer. And I said to him, maybe you should go inside. Things are not so safe. And he stayed outside, and he said, no, well, listen, I have to protect. We have to be proactive. And unfortunately, half an hour later, a terrorist walked over to him with a gun and killed him. And this was a terrible event, both because people were concerned that the terrorist was still on the loose, and the police literally almost closed down the entire city. This has not happened before in Copenhagen, and there was a tremendous amount of, this was the top news in Denmark. And what the result was over here, I don't know if this picture does quite justice to it, but the result was, starting with the Prime Minister, going to hundreds of thousands of Copenhageners, came over to the place where he had been shot, which was just outside the shul, and put flowers. Now over here, this is probably within the first few hours, but by the week, there was literally hundreds of thousands of flowers that were covering the street. And it really illustrated, and I also saw from the reaction from people, these strong feelings that the Danes have, that they feel that the Jews are an important and central part of Denmark, and therefore have to be treated and respected, and God forbid, not attacked. And the Danish government responded in a very interesting way. They said, we are going to protect the Jewish institutions. And so therefore, there are two Jewish institutions which have people living there the whole time, which is the Chabad house here, and the big synagogue has a building behind that has some people living there. We have 24 hours. It started off with police. We're talking about 7 policemen for 8 hours, 7 policemen for another 8 hours, 2 policemen at night from 11 to 7. Now they switched to soldiers. So we have 7 soldiers next door, that are there for 8 hours and then they switch off. So there are hundreds and thousands and millions dollar-wise of man hours that are being used to protect the Jewish institutions. And then there's the Jewish school, and then there's the Reform Synagogue, and then there's the kosher store, and there's various different things, the old age home and the Jewish museum. Each one of them is being protected by either police or military, which is arguably, I mean, when it was just police, it was a real drain on the resources of the city. There were literally about 200 policemen that were full-time involved in guarding the Jewish institution because of, you know, how many hours they can do and how many hours they needed for vacation and weekends and so forth. Now it's switched to military, it's a little bit less. A tremendous amount of resources has gone into protecting the Jewish community, and that is really, really, truly commendable. At the same time, the tremendous outpouring, literally, I mean, with these flowers, but also, you know, just walking down the street, people would walk over to me and shake my hand and hug me and say, we're so sorry to see this, this is really, you know, we feel for you, and a very strong outpouring of affection. Now, at the same time, Denmark, like most of Europe, is not a religious, hold on a second. Denmark, like most of Europe, is not a religious country. In fact, Denmark is one of the most non-religious countries in the world. And so therefore, there are certain things that they feel that they don't want happening. So the first one that happened was that in 2014, they outlawed shchita, which is slaughtering animals for kosher meat. And although that was not pleasant that it happened, but it did not inconvenience the Jewish community tremendously, because already 10 or 15 years earlier than that, the Jewish community made a calculation. It was possibly a mistake to have done that, but they made a calculation that it was cheaper to bring in meat from Belgium or Holland or Germany or something like that because of the open borders of the EU. And that's what they did. And so therefore, outlawing shchita did not have any actual concrete effect on the Jewish community. But it was, of course, of great concern. And part of the reason why it was of great concern, because we realized that what comes next is Brit Milah, circumcision. And it has come up a few times over the last 20 years, but especially over the last few years, a very serious effort to outlaw Brit Milah and to make that a person that does circumcision on their child should be jailed for 6 years. And this, of course, is a very difficult thing. And actually right now, over these last few days, there's a great concern that there might actually be a political majority within the parliament. So far, the vast majority of Danes, meaning you make a survey among Danes, 86% believe that it should be outlawed, right? There's very few people that believe it should be legal. But up until now, at least the government and the parliament has said, we don't want to be the one that says to the Jewish people, you're not welcome here. But now it seems that there's an effort that it could bring, that they could actually outlaw it. And that is, of course, a very serious thing. And we hope and pray that that will not happen. And obviously, if it does, we have to deal with that situation as you know, when it does, God forbid. I will, what should we say? 1 minute, let me just go back to my PowerPoint. I will, there we go. There are obviously many different negative things, and then there are, of course, positive things. This, I'm sure, is a pretty classic Chabad thing, is lighting a menorah on the central square. It's in the middle of the winter, it's dark, it's cold, but at the same time, it's an example of the Jewish experience that even in difficult situations, we light up the light and we bring that light forward. So I think now what we're going to do is we are going to take any questions, comments, or disagreements. I see the chat is active. Hold on, let's start with the chat. I live today in Copenhagen, which is where I have been for the last 24 years. The book, it's both in Danish, which is the book in Danish. I assume you're talking to Jørgen Kieler. The Danish one is called Hvorfor gjorde vi det? Why did we do it? which is obviously a good question. Why did they do it? The English one is called Resistance Fighter. And yes, and there's actually now a film that just came out in Danish with subtitles, which is Bird Over the Sound. The Sound is the name of that split of water between Denmark and Sweden. Right? Okay, the screen picture needs changing. Sorry about that. Had the descendants of the Portuguese Jews already assimilated before the arrival of the Russian refugees? No, to the extent that there was a fair amount of hostility. And in fact, the big synagogue, which was created in Kristallgade, was mainly the Portuguese Jews, and the Russian refugees didn't like praying there so much. They were called the Ostjuden, and they would make little prayer services of themselves. And actually the Machzikei Hadas synagogue, which was the little small break-off synagogue, which happened in 1910 when the rabbi got into a fight with the community, a lot of were descendants of the Russian Jews. And there are still some Portuguese Jews descendants that are still around today. The Jewish school, yes, is still active, and yes, my kids go there. It's active every day. Is it acceptable to do circumcision in the hospital for religious meeting? Right now, it is legal. There's an attempt to make it illegal, that unless you have a religious purpose for unless you have a medical grounds for doing it, that religion should not be a reason to do circumcision, irrelevant of where it's done. Already now, when you do a circumcision, a doctor needs to be present. So there's a great concern, meaning there's not a real way around it. You can't say, oh, well, we'll do it in the hospital and that's okay. So it's quite a very serious issue. About how many Jews are in Denmark? There's probably about 6,000 or 7,000 in Copenhagen, and another 1,000 Jews outside of Copenhagen. The immigration was in the 70s quite high, which is why we have Lebanese and Palestinian and Syrian immigrants and their descendants. Unfortunately, unlike the United States, which is an excellent country for integrating immigrants, Denmark in general and Europe, Denmark and Europe are not very good at integrating the next generation, right? I believe the United States now has a vice presidential candidate whose mother is Indian and whose father is African American. You don't have this in Europe. Second generation remains somewhat, they're called second generation, and that's a challenge. And that's part of the reason why you have in societies, we had it in England, there was a terror attack. In Denmark, there was a terror attack, which means these people do not feel integrated enough and are attacking the very societies that brought them up. And that's a very tragic and sad thing. And as Jews, we're often bearing the brunt of it. So the issue of terrorism in Europe is very connected with the issue of integration and the ability of immigrant societies to integrate. And the Muslim societies are having a harder time integrating, partially because they're not that used to integrating into becoming minority societies, but also because the local society is not necessarily as open-armed and welcome as they could be. Given the proximity to Germany, what is unique to Danes and Swedes that in general they had favorable views of Jews? It was precisely the proximity to Germany that made the Danes positive towards Jews, because they didn't like the Germans. They didn't like the Germans first. And therefore, and actually arguably, their defense and protection and rescue of the Jews was more a sign of their negative feelings to Germany than it was of their love for Jews. So, it's good that they didn't like each other, because the Danes and the Germans have had many wars, right? When I mentioned before that you had the border shifting between up to Kolding and down to Hamburg and up and down, those were all wars that happened between Denmark and Germany. So there's, even when people have had a war and they've officially made peace, there's still negative feelings. And so there's negative feelings between the Danes and the Germans, even arguably. I mean, today it's more of a joke, but even arguably today. Has the pandemic had an effect on Denmark? So the latest statistic, yes, the answer, of course, as it has everywhere. I will, just to give you a brief thing on Denmark, I will say that I saw a statistic that said that Danes are of the opinion that the Danish government, meaning of people that think their governments handled it well. I think in the United States, it's about 47% think the government handled it well, or maybe even less. Whereas in Denmark, 95% think the government handled it well. The 9th of March, we closed down the country very quickly. And then the 20th of April, only 40 days later, they started reopening. The kids went back to school the 20th of April. And now, more or less, things are functioning as usual. We have limits how many people can be in a room, and there are different rules and laws that we're careful with. But more or less, things are back to normal. They just made a rule about when you travel in the train, you need to wear a mask. But otherwise, it's taken pretty easy. The government also came with a nice package for compensation for people to be able to pay salaries and for small businesses and so forth. So I think Denmark has done quite well in the pandemic, also being quite realistic about, let's open up. Let's not, I mean, I see now all my siblings that live in the United States, you have kids going back to schools and they're wearing masks and in plastic things. And the Danes said, we're not going to pretend that that's possible to do. They're going to hug each other and they're going to, and it hasn't seen any negative effect to the best of my knowledge. So, but I don't want to get into, that's a political discussion these days about things, but Denmark has taken it in quite which means being serious, what they feel about the things that are important and saying the things that we're not, if we're going to focus on too much, we're not going to be able to be successful. So it's been quite well. 600 people have died from the pandemic out of a society of 6 million. So that's quite a good statistic. Did any percentage leave for Israel after the war? Yes. In fact, Denmark has one of the highest rates of aliyah. And part of the reason is not because it's actually physically difficult to be Jewish, although now that might actually become that you have a difficulty being Jewish, but because of socially. It's such a small Jewish community. If you have 20 kids in the same class and you want to marry a Jew, right, half of them are boys, so you have a very small, you've got 10 people or whatever, I mean, it could be different ages, but, people want to marry a Jew, people want to bring up their children as Jewish. So a fair amount of the people, especially the people that become more religious, they do tend to move to Israel, and we've seen that. It's a very social country. When I say so, and so therefore people are impacted by the environment. So you have my kids; they're the only religious kids in their class, so that can be challenging. There are other people like that. They say, we want to move to Israel or the United States. Senator Harris's father is from Jamaica. Sorry about that, but I guess that's also considered an immigrant. I'm not familiar with all the terminology. Who are the enemies of the Danish? The Danish they like everybody. I think. Well, I mean, they in the Cold War, they were definitely on the side of the Allies. They're friends with Israel. They're friends with the United States. There was going to be a presidential visit earlier this year, but due to the unwillingness of Denmark to sell Greenland, that was nullified. But the Danish are, they're positive, they're realistic, they're part of the European Union. They've actually, within the European Union, the Israeli ambassador tells me they're considered good friends of Israel. I know there's a very strong security cooperation. I know there's a fair amount of this, I shouldn't say this publicly, but Israeli companies that are offering security to the Israeli intelligence and military. So there's good cooperation and good cooperation with the United States in very many areas. So do we have any more questions?
Question. Is Yiddish taught or spoken in any of the communities?
That's an excellent question. I speak Yiddish to my children. There's a Yiddish radio, but we're kind of short of people to speak on the Yiddish radio. So I get called, it's once a month, and I get called almost every time because they need someone to fill it. So
So
not that
Yiddish
part.
is not taught in schools.
No, Yiddish is not taught in the school. No. And Paul Katz says we met in Shul before the Baltic cruise. Great. Yes, this is very common. The Baltic cruises and the cruises to the fjords. We get a lot of people in the summer that come through. This year has been, of course, for us personally, usually in the Chabad house, we have 100, 150 people eating here every Shabbat. This year has been very different, very quiet. We've been just 30, 40 people. So,
Thank you.
I have a question.
yes, Julia.
The Muslim community will also be affected if circumcision is outlawed. Do you know how they're responding to this question?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And the answer is they are being clever. And they realize that if they come out with great protestations, that is only going to increase the likelihood of it passing. So their imams have told them, just with the only way that this can be saved is through the Jews. Because the Jewish community has a sympathetic, right? That's the way it is. Because the Jewish community, there's sympathy. The only thing holding them back right now is the resistance of the Jewish community and the fact that we're saying that you're effectively kicking us out of the country if you make a circumcision. That's the only thing that's holding it back. If the Muslims say we're going to demonstrate and we're going to burn books and we're going to burn whatever it is, that's only going to increase the likelihood of it passing. That's the irony. So yes, the Muslims are being affected, but actually the Muslims are being, in this case, very smart about it and realizing that if they make a demonstration with 10,000 people and flags on the street and stuff like that, that's only going to speed up the process with the Danes saying, we don't like this foreign element here. So that's the, okay, Paul Katz, hold on. First of all, we have a Yiddish Winkel in Houston by Zoom. Very nice, thank you. Maybe we can get you one time on our radio, that would be nice. Paul Katz said about the time that the Torah had to be moved, and this is during the Holocaust. The Jews left, escaped, and the church down the street, the priest said, I know that we don't want the Nazis to desecrate the synagogue. Let's go and rescue the Torahs. So they went into the synagogue. They actually had to go twice, and one of the times they actually brought an ambulance and they pretended the Torahs were wounded people. They wrapped the Torahs up in a blanket and they put a couple of them, maybe either 2 or 4, on a stretcher. They carried them out, put them in the ambulance, and drove the ambulance down the street to the church, where they were placed in safekeeping in the church, because there was 2 sets. There were 7 Torahs on the top in the ark, but there were another about 50 Torahs underneath, which were from the smaller Jewish communities, the ones that were all around Denmark that closed down. And so they rescued these Torahs and brought them there. So that was later on at the end of the war, when the Jews returned, they brought them back, and there was a great celebration when they brought them back. Now, Linda asks a good question, which is regarding the medical community. And part of the issue is that the medical community over here, at least, is of the opinion that there's no medical benefit to circumcision. And it's sort of because of the resistance to religion in general. It's not an anti-Jewish thing. It's an anti-religion thing, right? They believe religion is not logical, and therefore there's a negativity towards religion, and therefore coming out doctors, including Jewish doctors, are having difficulty coming out and saying that they support circumcision, because then they're being accused that they're not being professional, that they are bowing their scientific opinion to religious perspective. So it's actually a very sad situation where instead of, again, it's hard for me to be an objective, I'm a rabbi, but objectively there is good medical opinions that say that circumcision is beneficial. There are some that say circumcision is not beneficial. So stop getting so excited right? There's a good opinions that say that it is beneficial. But because of this negativity towards religion, there's this like this thing, there's nothing for it, it's primitive, and therefore it's terrible. You know, a couple of years ago, there was a conference here. Copenhagen is a very popular conference city. There was a conference of urologists, like 2,000 of them. And like all good doctor conferences, a good percentage of them are Jewish. And a bunch of them were religious. And Friday night, we had 10 or 15 urologists sitting around the table. And so they were from different countries: Israel, South Africa, the United States, Canada, and Europe, France and England. And I went around the table and I said, help me, what do you think about circumcision? And the Europeans are like, wow, there's real pressure to try to outlaw it, da, da, da. The Israel one is, of course, why not circumcise? The American one is the same thing. Of course, why not circumcise? Everybody circumcises. The South African one is like, not you can circumcise, we circumcise everybody because of AIDS. You know, so you really had these different perspectives. And, you know, you would argue it's all about medical science, but it seems as if the, you know, social environment that people are living in is very much impacting their opinions. And that's very, very sad. Right, all cancer, and so is AMA. I think it's a good question. Okay, I don't know the medical details, but remember that America is not England or Europe, and in Europe apparently the doctors are not for it. Abortion is legal in Denmark. Yes, abortion is legal. Pornography. Denmark is famous for being the first place to allow pornography. So it's a very liberal society. And here the attitude is why are we allowing, you know, parents to do this to their children? You know, so with all the various arguments that come with it. So unfortunately,